Okay, good evening to everyone. I'll start immediately in English. It's a great privilege for me this evening to host our guest from the United States, but at the present time teaching in Hungary, Gladdena Pappina. Before I introduce you, I just want to say a few things about TSOK. We're starting to resume again activities after a break with COVID, because of COVID. And we hope to start soon, perhaps a course in Latin that Yaksha is initiating. So we want to cultivate this culture, Western culture, and Latin has, of course, a huge role in that. Also, I want to greet Željka and Tihomir. I was telling Gladden earlier, we have a very select group of guests in the audience, and this is a safe place for how we see the world. So feel free to speak your mind. Don't feel in any way, need to be reserved about things. This is a group that is very like-minded and friendly. We'll see. Yes. Perhaps on economics we don't see always eye to eye, but on culture and yes. And I want to thank Robin Harris and Jure Kristo for coming. It's been some time since I've seen you in person, Jure. So it's good to see that you're alive and kicking.
Barely.
Gladden is going to speak about integralism this evening. He's going to make some remarks about that, and then we'll have some discussion. It's basically, it's a lively debate within the Catholic world, of course. It hasn't quite made it to Croatia, but I think it is worth paying attention to. Croatia, of course, is predominantly a Catholic country, always has been. We are under attack now from different directions, especially Brussels. We have guests from Brussels as well, so who are fighting what I'm talking about. But it's, we just had a panel earlier today about woke ideology. There's many different forms that these threats take, but I think it's important that Catholics in particular are well-informed and ready to make the case for a robust Christian culture still today, especially in Europe. I think that's very necessary, and that's why the Center for Renewal of Culture, TSOK, exists for this purpose. So thank you for accepting the invitation. Gladden is on the faculty at the University of Dallas, also a very safe place, I would say, compared to other universities in America. But it's very good that you're here in Croatia. We're looking forward to your remarks. Feel at home, and without further ado, the floor is yours. So thank you.
And how long do we have again?
Well, 40 minutes, let's say.
For the talk part? Okay, great. Well, I'm very delighted to be here with all of you this evening. Thanks so much for coming to the talk. I've been giving talks all day long, actually, so I'm on automatic pilot. So, but also a bit spent as well from intense discussions of just how crazy things have gotten in the United States. So this talk is a report on how things are getting crazy in the United States in a different area, in a different way, with new forms or maybe old forms of Catholic political thought. And I have a lot of thoughts coming to mind, and so it will be, apologies if I'm not perfectly clear in sorting them out, but I will try to give an impression of some recent movements and discussions in the Catholic world in the United States. And I think it's a topic that also provides some connection between American Catholicism and Europe, at least some forms of Catholic political thinking that are more traditional in Europe than they are in the United States, which is a very liberal, very Anglo-Saxon country? Well, there has been, in short, a number of new movements in the American Catholic intellectual scene on the right wing in the last few years. And two terms have been used in particular and become somewhat prominent, I would say, intellectual movements. And I think both of them, they're very closely related, and it's somewhat surprising that these movements are coming about. And so Stephen mentioned one, which is integralism or integralism. I have no idea how to pronounce it correctly myself, so I say integralism. And the other is called post-liberalism. And these two are related, and they are both kind of reactions to the state of political thought and political life in the Western world. So, for most of the last 150 or 200 years, American political thought has operated primarily within what we would call liberalism. So this is a vision of politics in which political power is justified on the basis of a very narrow, commonly agreed upon set of human demands for liberty and security and order. And if we can focus on these few things and put out of mind conflict and disagreements over the ultimate ends or goals of human life, then we can achieve a flourishing modern society. So liberalism, I take to be this particular justification of political power on a narrow, easily agreed upon basis. And then what liberal society is supposed to do is to then continue to expand liberty and expand security and secure public order. So there are different layers of this liberal world that we live in. So there's that basic justification of political power. There's the expansion of liberty and security, the expansion of equality. And then on top of all that, there's also a geopolitical view that global society itself will become more liberal and democratic. People everywhere will begin to be able to realize their innate desires for freedom. So this was a driving force in American foreign policy, particularly after the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s through the early 2000s. The archetype of that form of liberalism might be George W. Bush's second inaugural address in 2005, in which he, I can't remember the exact phrase, but spoke about the spark of human freedom in every heart, and even as I recall, referenced. It was kind of, some people said he drew on some Christian rhetoric as well. And as the U.S. was engaged in military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time, the idea that was put forward by the neoconservatives was that an American military power would liberate these people who had been living in authoritarian regimes, and they would be able to realize the innate desire for human liberty that is found everywhere. This world also had a commercial element to it. You notice I just started speaking in the past tense. This world had a commercial element in it. The spreading of Western capitalism everywhere would be a sign that the world was becoming more liberal. Liberalism means free markets. Free markets means that American brands get to spread everywhere because American brands are better, according to one version of this. So we need to have McDonald's everywhere. And this was really taken to be a big thing in the 1990s, like the opening of McDonald's in Moscow, the opening of Pizza Hut the Soviet Union. Gorbachev played a role in a Pizza Hut commercial, this sort of stuff. And I remember being a very cranky and bratty teenager traveling around with my grandfather, who was taking me everywhere. And as a good, American 12 or 13-year-old, in fact, I only liked Pizza Hut. And so wherever he took me, I sadly insisted that we go to Pizza Hut. So in the 1990s, I actually myself sampled Pizza Hut all over the world, much to the frustration of my grandfather who was taking me on these trips. So I remember this world well. Other characteristics of this global liberal society are that it would include smooth global financial flows, global supply chains. Doesn't matter where things are made. In the global paradise, we would have globally distributed workforces. So we could have cheap labor in China, manufacturing goods. We can import them in the United States, and there's no problem with this, nothing to worry about at all. There would be, society itself would eventually become softer. There would be a rise in the service sector, the internet economy. We're going to get rich because of the internet and cheap labor. So we've got cheap labor in China manufacturing stuff, and we can consume that and enjoy, Netflix and work at our computers all day long. This will be a wonderful world. Also, according to these liberal expectations, there would be religion would become less relevant in public life, and that's a good thing. So the European Union cannot bring itself to acknowledge the role of Christianity at the heart of Europe. It's unable to do that. And that means religion is becoming less relevant in their mind. In the United States, we've always had separation of church and state. So public life has, for a long time, been becoming more secular with less or fewer expressions of religion in public life. No prayer in public schools, for example. Also, on these liberal expectations, non-democratic powers like Russia and China would steadily become democratic. This was the 1990s expectation. China will become free because we'll basically trade it to death. We'll trade with it so much that they'll become capitalists. And maybe they have, but they certainly haven't become Democrats. So, and it seems that that hasn't been the case in Russia either, from what I understand. A strange thing happened this last year is that the West began to, I think, doubt a lot of these fundamental expectations and commitments that it had formed in the 1990s. In reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a professor at the Yale School of Management published a list, like a blacklist, of all American companies that were operating in Russia, including McDonald's. And the next day, in the Wall Street Journal and in other papers and in the media, the move was, these companies need to withdraw from Russia right now because it is immoral to be present in Russia now that they have engaged in this extraordinary aggression. So there was like a pulling out of all of the American brands, or a lot of them. McDonald's, for example, pulled out. And I think this reflects a change in the air around the belief in the power of liberalism and markets to go together. So in the 1990s, we thought, more McDonald's will lead to liberalization in Russia and China. And I guess now, after 2022, we no longer think that. If we thought that McDonald's and Western companies, the presence of the Western companies in Russia would make it more liberal and democratic, then wouldn't we send more? Like, wouldn't we have more activity, do more trade? But there's been this crisis of belief in liberalism, I think, in the West as well. At the same time, we have seen liberalism also become more aggressively promoting of particular lifestyles in the United States. So it seems to be that we're at a stage where liberalism is not simply hands-off. It's not simply laissez-faire in terms of its cultural and lifestyle approach, but it now demands that you adhere to it and prove that you are a liberal. So liberalism is no longer just the absence of a way of life. It's not just a baseline of freedom within which you can choose to be a Catholic or choose to be an atheist or something, but it's instead very aggressively trying to produce a particular character type. The reasons for this would be the subject for another talk, and probably very complicated and difficult to untangle. But the basic element, I think, or the basic fact is something like that. According to the kind of inner logic of liberalism, once we have a society that's based on liberty, there should be more liberty over time. People should be able to choose their own way of life without having, in an unencumbered way, without having the pressure of their past, tradition, custom, weighing down on top of them. So at some point, liberalism, according to this logic, starts to want you to prove that you're taking advantage of it. Using the hard-won freedom of modern liberal society to just become a traditional Catholic. Well, that's not the idea. That's not the goal. That's not why we've engaged in a multi-century long struggle against the church and tradition and conservative customs. We did that so that you could become a liberal, and so now you need to become one. And they've become, and at least in the United States, this is part of the woke ideology, very, very insistent in demanding that you prove that you're a liberal. So liberalism in the United States now feels not like a baseline of freedom, but a very aggressive imposition of a new set of expectations. You will leave behind your traditions and customs. You will abandon your traditional sexual mores and customs. You will denounce those who are trying to drag us back in that direction. You will denounce Trump. I think in the Trump era is sort of the era in which this changed, at least in the American universities, and until that time you could kind of be quiet as a Catholic. I spent 12 years at Harvard, so I learned to navigate what you could say when, and we had a lot of fun. But in the last few years, for example, it's no longer optional to participate, to prove that you're a liberal. You have to do it. It's obligatory. So, for example, when they introduced in English the idea of the choosing your own gender pronoun, that you could, even if you are a biological male and identify as a male, you need to put parenthesis he/him in your name on LinkedIn or at the bottom of your email or at the beginning of a class. And if you don't do that, then you're suspect, right? Again, even if I got an email recently from the Harvard libraries. These are librarians. These should be like the most boring people. They should not be at the cutting edge of advanced social decay. And they're all very nice women, all about 60-year-old women. And every single one, there were like 10 of them who signed this email with some information about the Harvard libraries. And every single one said, parenthesis, she, her, after. So none of them was transgender, right? They all adhered to their biological sex, but every single one of them, offered the grain of incense to the new gods. Just put in a little bit of incense to the transgender gods. And if you don't, you might lose your job, or don't even apply for a job at a liberal institution. I'm very grateful to be at a Catholic institution which refuses to cooperate with these things. So those are some observations. A couple more observations before we get to the Catholic stuff. I'm trying to paint the scene. Maybe I'm done. Just lost my page. There we go. A couple of other observations just to continue to paint the scene. On a political level, the modern liberalism, as I said, tried to separate traditional concerns about the good or the purpose or end of human life from the modern rationale for politics. People disagree about religion, and therefore we should find some elementary common ground like safety and security on which to agree. And I've said that in reality, if we look at America's most progressive and most liberal cities, take San Francisco, for example, it's mandatory to use those personal pronouns, and also the streets are not safe. So we no longer have the elementary liberalism of public security and order at all. The most progressive cities are wastelands, but you have to, in that same place, show that you're enlightened by, using drugs or, using your personal pronouns and being unmoored from traditional family obligations, etc. There are other elements of this separation that I've drawn from the work of Pierre Manon, the French political philosopher. He describes 6 different separations that are key parts of modern society. This would be the separation and distinction of professions, or the division of labor. In the economic world, we have a steady separation of different types of professions. We have the separation of powers in politics, so the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch are all separate. We have the separation of church and state. So the tasks of the state and the church are put in completely separate categories. And as I'll say, the understanding of the church itself undergoes a change as part of that process. There's a separation of civil society and the state. So civil society institutions are supposed to, exist, flourish entirely on their own. They're not any longer, particularly in the United States, overseen or directed by the state. Most of them don't, at least in the U.S., aren't state-funded, but we have a multiplicity of private associations and elements of civil society that are organized independently. And finally, the separation of science and values. So in the modern world, we're supposed to consider science as occupying its own territory, separate from the world of values. At least this is how some advanced, supposedly advanced scientists think about it. So the post-liberal worldview, I think, is motivated by the idea that each element of the liberal world that I've described is unsustainable, even on its own terms. So, as I said, liberalism is no longer just allowing you to have freedom and to follow the way of life that you want, but it is aggressively trying to impose a specific way of life upon you in a non-liberal way. According to a more classic understanding of politics, as you would find in Aristotle, for example, The purpose of every human action is oriented towards some good, and every political society seeks to realize some specific goal. So it's somehow baked into human nature that we want society to express some particular goal. It's not surprising that liberals themselves would turn their way of life into a specific goal. We have these other aspects of the liberal system that I've described also seem to be collapsing or becoming more difficult to maintain. So, for example, the separation of economic production from nations. Doesn't matter where things are produced. We can have the labor over in China and the consumption in America, and everything will work fine. Well, that has not worked out very well, particularly since the beginning of the COVID era, when there was like a collapse in global supply chains. Suddenly, it's impossible to complete manufacturing in the United States because you're waiting for some particular component part to come in from China. So, the idea that political communities, the integrity of political communities, where we can have shared tradition and culture, and manufacture things that we need. That in a particular country we have to be concerned for our domestic economic production as well. That idea is coming back. So the pure global liberalism of the 1990s that said this doesn't matter where things are produced, it can be somewhere else. There's a strong rejection or reaction against that. So if the modern liberal system is based on these separations, the post-liberal worldview is observing the way that there's now a reaction against that, or a demand for I would call it the reintegration of political communities. There have been a lot of different. I think there's maybe not one exclusive political phenomenon you can point to that captures all of them, but there have been a lot of particular reactions against this. So the election of Trump and the rise of populism in the United States, this was motivated by workers who had basically lost all of their dignity along with their jobs, as liberalism, ignoring borders and ignoring the need for economic sovereignty, watched everything walk away. Similarly, I guess you see it in Europe as well, the tensions between national sovereignty and the European Union. So the European Union came into its modern form, under this 1990s liberal system. Borders don't matter anymore. In fact, borders are racist. We can't have any concern for who lives in particular countries. We can't. We shouldn't have a right to maintain our traditions and cultures. But instead, the European Union is realizing a higher type of human being over time. A human being that's not bound by, place, tradition, and culture, but instead kind of moves smoothly like among tons of different places. So, constantly flying hither and yon as you participate in the top, 0.05% of society as a, unencumbered businessman or businesswoman traveling hither and yon. My sense is that all of these things are beginning to crumble, and that there's a lot of the current political phenomena consist in a reaction against that. So, as I've said, political movements today are likelier to express these particular visions of what the human good is, and as I've said, the global liberal political order itself seems to be over. Like, we seem to be moving into a more multipolar world, where the expectations that were set by the 1990s form of liberalism are gone. So that's a brief overview of post-liberalism, and I'm going to take a little sip of water and then talk about where the kind of new developments within Catholic thought fit within this. So American conservatives have tended to be very liberal over time. American conservatives are like an earlier version of modern liberalism, an earlier, more traditional version. American conservatives want to be left alone to form communities, to form churches, start new ones, to form civil associations, yes, start new religions as well. We have a multiplicity of new religions that you can select from in the United States. And this has, I think, tended to shape or even limit Catholic political thinking in the United States. Catholics in the United States don't think about Catholicism as a global entity that they are a part of, but instead they tend to go through a thought process like the following. America is the greatest country in the history of the world. Obviously, this is what every red-blooded American thinks. But America has discovered a wonderful political system that produces extraordinary freedom and prosperity, but it needs a little injection of Catholic moral principles in order to function better. So it's almost like the American system accidentally functions perfectly, except that it just needs a little bit of leaven from Catholicism. But aside from that, there's been very little thought about, very little thought or reflection on, the nature of how modern liberalism separates spiritual and civil concerns. So I think what has been happening among Catholics and young Catholics, excuse me, and young Catholics especially, is that as liberalism has become more aggressive, as it has, sought to pursue and instantiate a particular goal, Catholics, especially young Catholics, are asking themselves, well, what is our specific goal? What do we as Catholics want to achieve? Is there a Catholic political goal? And if so, what is it? So in the earlier version or earlier tendency, there's America exists, Catholics are within it, and we have a good understanding of virtue and morality, and so Catholics have injected the pro-life movement into American politics. And we did that in order to save liberalism from its excesses. Like, it's basically good, but tends to go a little bit too far radically in the direction of human autonomy, and therefore Catholics should, Catholics launched the pro-life movement in the 1970s in the United States in order to save liberalism from itself, or something like that. The new tendency, or the new, call it a curiosity, is for this more robust exploration of what Catholicism's ultimate political viewpoint is. And this has led to a new exploration, I think, or renewed, maybe not new, but renewed exploration of the tensions between the Catholicism's self-understanding and that of liberalism. And the point at which this conflict comes up, or is coming up most clearly, is in the understanding of the church itself. So one of the main goals of modern liberalism was to resolve the fact that human beings were, in the Christian era or the Catholic era, subject to two different political systems. A civil political system, but were also members of a real religious community that was not merely like a club, but an actual institution that was hierarchically organized and spread all over the world and governed itself. And you know, as we've explored this topic more clearly, you know, you start to realize that liberalism from the beginning has always viewed as its particular enemy, or the thing that it is particularly in tension with, is the notion of the church as an independent political society, as a real organization that has power over itself, you know, power to determine power to realize the goal that Christ gave to it, and the freedom to act and pursue that all over the world. So integralism then is an intellectual movement designed to recover that kind of political thought. And from my standpoint, as someone who writes about public policy, more than I write about theology. I'm not a theologian, I'm a political theorist, so I'm interested in the political aspect of this. What I see is that Catholics, particularly I'm talking about American Catholics, young politically inclined American Catholics, in the old system, where Catholicism is just kind of like a little supplement to America, had a very, very limited political imagination. They had very, very modest goals, just to kind of like help a little bit if they could. And meanwhile, they got absolutely steamrolled by an aggressive liberalism that was confident and had a very clear understanding of what it wanted to achieve, namely the complete liberation of people from any kind of unchosen obligations that they have in every domain of human life. And this aggressive liberalism carefully waited over a long period of time and took advantage of many opportunities and finally established itself. And the thing that I'm seeing and also trying to promote among young Catholics is to have a vision more like the Catholic version of that. So from the Catholic standpoint, what is the Catholic viewpoint, traditional Catholic viewpoint, on the purpose of politics, the ultimate ends of human life, how politics should relate to those ends, and how politics should relate to the church. So a few years ago, an American-Austrian priest named Pater Edmund Waldstein started to write about this, and he put together the following 3-sentence summary of integralism, which has become, I think, the kind of standard definition, and also it's very short, it's very punchy, and therefore it's open to lots of controversy. So I'll just read it to you since it's very short. It says, Catholic integralism is a tradition of thought that rejecting the liberal separation of politics from concern with the end of human life, holds that political rule must order man to his final goal. So integralism rejects all of these liberal separations. I said liberalism is founded on the separation of politics from the final end or purpose of human life, at least initially. And so Catholic integralism rejects that and holds to the classical or Aristotelian teaching that politics should order human beings to their goal of flourishing and to the common good of the community as a whole. Continuing, since, however, man has both a temporal, worldly, and an eternal end, integralism holds that there are two powers that rule him, a temporal power and a spiritual power. Well, this is not hard for Catholics to accept, should not be hard for Catholics to accept, although in contemporary times maybe we don't think of the church as a spiritual power, but the church is a spiritual power. Certainly it claims the power of binding and loosing sins. In the confessional, it's kind of, being in the confessional is kind of like being in a little courtroom that you voluntarily go into and, put yourself in the presence of God's representative, and luckily they can't condemn you to a prison term, but formerly they used to assign pretty heavy penances, from what I understand. We've all received funny ones from time to time, I imagine. And so the third sentence, and this is the third sentence has drawn the most controversy, and part of the reason that I'm saving it for this portion of the talk rather than beginning with it is because I have a different interpretation. So the third sentence of this is, and since man's temporal end is subordinated to his eternal end, the temporal power must be subordinated to the spiritual power. So the civil power should be subordinated to the church. And as you might imagine, particularly in the American context, where we have a very strong tradition of separation of church and state, this final or third sentence of integralism, if you will, has gotten all of the attention. All of the critical reaction, commentary, debate on left and right has been about this. Right-wing people typically say something like the following: "Are you kidding? Have you seen the bishops lately? Really? You think the German bishops should be given more power? Haven't you seen how the German church tax has completely corrupted the German church, and you want them to rule, you want bishops to rule cities?" Of course, it doesn't say anything about bishops ruling cities. But you tend to get a reaction kind of like that. My view is that as I said in the first 20 or 30 minutes of the talk, liberalism consists in separating things that either are joined in human nature, like politics and human happiness and the good of human life, or that are, at least in Christian society, supposed to be pretty highly correlated, like church and state. So for most of Western history, church and state have been in some way in a good relationship and coordinated. In the formulation that is offered by Pater Edmund, when he says that the temporal power should be subordinated to the spiritual power, there's an extraordinary, detailed discussion of this throughout the history of Catholic teaching. So Thomas Aquinas, for example, says there are two ways that that if you have two powers, there are two different ways they can be related. Number one, when you have a superior power which delegates an inferior power, such as when a prime minister sends an ambassador, or a country sends an ambassador. The ambassador is totally subordinate to the higher power. The ambassador can be recalled, the ambassador is given instructions, the ambassador is not a free person. Thomas Aquinas says there's another way that powers can be said to be superior and inferior, and that is if one power establishes two other powers and arranges them over different but lower and higher things. And he says that's what it means when we say that the church is superior to the civil power and the civil power is subordinated to the state. God created the civil, endowed the civil power with legitimate oversight over ordinary civil concerns, and the Lord established the church to guide men to their heavenly goal. The rub or the difficulty is like when these two things overlap, how do you deal with cases that are on the margin? So these were the classic elements of medieval history, like should clerics be subordinated to civil courts and things like that. This is actually not a hypothetical matter these days. We were just talking about Cardinal Pell beforehand, who was obviously tried and thrown in jail by a vagabond civil court, and Cardinal Zen has encountered the same thing. So this is not an entirely hypothetical medieval discussion. In fact, the conflict between the secular power and the church, in many respects, maybe we could say, depending on what the country is, you might have to say in Germany between the state and like good Catholics, because maybe some of the bishops are even more eagerly advancing liberalism than the state itself. But this is not a hypothetical thing. So in the United States, Catholic schools, should Catholic schools be, do Catholic schools have the right to instruct their children, and on what basis? Is it because there should be a special exemption carved out for them from within the civil law, which the civil power can take away at will? Or is there something more fundamental at stake, like the integrity of the church itself? Of course, particularly in modern liberal contexts, it doesn't do the church much good to approach the civil power seeking an exemption by waving the flag of its superiority or something like that. But it is important for us to, as Catholics at least, to understand what the church is in its nature. And the church in its nature is a real assembly of men, human beings, in a real perfect society that is like a city. So it is a quasi-political thing. It is something in which, through baptism, one becomes a true citizen and incurs obligation and can likewise avail oneself of the benefits of that citizenship or membership as well, such as access to the sacraments. But I think that at the broadest level, and I'll conclude here and see what you want to talk about this. At the broadest level, I would just go back to the point that I made at the beginning. Liberalism has become much more aggressive in trying to realize a specific goal. And so Catholics reacting to this are saying, all right, well, we need to formulate and understand what our goal is as well. And that is to make a society, a political society that helps human beings to achieve their true and proper end in this world and relate well with the spiritual power which guides them to their end in the next world. So you can call that integralism, you can call it political Catholicism, you can call it a traditional understanding of what the church is. A lot of people pour derision and scorn upon this and say something like, good luck achieving that, good luck achieving that. But, for me, the important thing is like, what are the ideas that motivate people to political action. Well, on the left, even on their own understanding, like their goal is always infinitely in the future because they want to push things as far as they possibly can. You know, they don't give up for that reason, and they spend a lot of time in political and formation trying to understand what their goal is and achieve it. So I think it actually makes Catholics more effective participants in politics to take this kind of view and to move their, move the window, the range of their thinking away from or beyond just narrow daily political debates to understand the true nature of the institution that they're a part of. I think ultimately that it's, I haven't really been talking about problems within the church, but I think that it's important for the church to have an accurate understanding of itself as well, to understand that it is supposed to be a comprehensive society oriented toward the realization of our spiritual end. And to my mind, the correct way to respond to problems and crises within the church is not to try to restrict it, hold it down, take away the remaining power that it does have, but to call it to realize and live out the fullness of what it is. Most medieval political writing took this form. People, they were called mirrors of princes. So this was like an ideal description of what the prince is supposed to be and what his virtues are supposed to be, so that the prince, in reading the mirror of princes, could learn what the virtues are and how he's supposed to carry them out. So the modern or the liberal instinct is to say, well, because people are prone to bad behavior, you should take away their power and like hold them down and pin politics down and like tack it down to the ground here so that it doesn't get up too high and cause trouble. But I think this the non-liberal approach in politics and in ecclesiology, or the nature of the church, is to describe things the way that they really are, so that we have something to aspire to. And as liberalism has gotten more aggressive, there's more interest in that. And so that is my background on the contemporary debate. So happy to take questions and discuss.